So today we're going to be talking about something that's been kind of on my heart for a little while. I read through Matthew, the book of Matthew, just before Easter, like building up to that, and just wanted to kind of have some context for what was happening as Jesus went to the cross and was raised from the dead. It's something that kind of hit me as I was reading through Matthew. There's this idea of this contrast between like being ready and being prepared for something, and it really stood out to me in several of the stories. And so that's kind of what we're going to unpack here today. This idea of being ready for something and being prepared and the difference that they are. We use those words a lot of times interchangeably, and so we're going to try to unpack that. When we ask, are you ready or are you prepared, we kind of mean different things. Sometimes we use them interchangeably. But like Carrie and I, when we walk out the door like with the kids, like when we come to church, we'll say, are we ready? And sometimes we mean like, okay, does everybody have their, underwear and shoes on? Like, are we dressed for church? Like, are we prepared to go out the door? And then sometimes we're like looking at each other, we're like, are you ready? Are we ready to do this? And there's a difference there. And I don't know about you guys, but I like to prepare for everything, like over-prepare. So if you're going on a trip or you're packing a bag or whatever, you think of all the different possible things you can need, and you're like, I need to make sure I have this. I need to make sure that I am prepared. I need to have all the things that could take care of anything that could go wrong. What we're going to see as we look through a couple of these stories in Matthew today is that's not how Jesus is calling people to follow him. He's not asking them to have everything packed, all the preparations made, everything that they could possibly need. As we think about this, I think we assume that readiness is dictated by how prepared we are for something. So as we read through this, think of like ready as a posture of our heart and like a mindset and attitude towards something. Like, are we ready to walk out the door? And preparedness as like, having your supplies or whatever. So we're going to read through a few different stories. We're going to read through when Jesus calls Peter and his first disciples, when Jesus calls Matthew to follow him, the tax collector. We're going to read a short story about the cost of following Jesus. There's the story of the 5,000 that were fed by a couple of loaves and fish, and then we're going to follow up again with Peter and his desire to be just close to Jesus. And as we read through these stories, I just want to remind us that Jesus was here on earth at this time. Like through all of these stories, like Jesus was here in the flesh. And he came to fulfill God's promise to redeem his people from sin. So in the beginning, God created everything. He created the Garden of Eden in perfection. Adam and Eve were there. And he told them not to eat of one fruit, or the fruit of one tree, and they disobeyed. And that was like how sin entered the world. And then there was separation from God because God is perfect and he cannot be in the presence of sin. And all the Old Testament and all the stories are pointing to a Redeemer, a Savior who would come and redeem God's people to himself. And that's why Jesus is here. He hasn't gone to the cross yet, but that is his purpose for being here on the earth. So now that we know what we're going to kind of talk about, I'm going to go ahead and just pray, and then we're going to jump into Matthew 4. God, thank you for your word. Thank you for the fact that we can trust that it is true. God, as we read about different people who interacted with Jesus, I pray that we would consider how we respond to Jesus. And as we break out this idea of being ready to follow Jesus, I pray that we see that it's not dependent on how prepared we are. God, I pray that we would hear you today and not just a nervous guy up front. Amen. Okay, so I'm going to go to Matthew chapter 4. And this is where Jesus first calls Peter, also called Simon. I'm going to read verses 18 through 22. So Jesus is walking along the shore, and he says, and he said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you," back up, 18. "While walking by the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, who was called Peter, and Andrew, his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And he said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." Immediately they left their nets and followed him. And going on from there, he saw two other brothers, James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother, in the boat with Zebedee, their father, mending their nets, and he called them. Immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him. So, first thing I want to point out, Jesus wasn't just like some stranger on the beach. Like Peter and these guys, they likely knew who Jesus was. They'd heard of him. They'd seen him around. They knew that there was something like different about this guy. We're going to talk about real quickly who Peter was now. Peter's kind of the one that we're going to like focus in on a little bit today. And this is pulled from various texts, but Peter it says he was a fisherman. And later on in Acts, like when he is proclaiming the good news of Jesus, him and John, they like heal a guy, and then all the religious leaders are like, "How did you do this?" And he's telling them like it's by the power and authority of Jesus. Like the guy you crucified, it's by his power that we were able to do this. And they're all like blown away, and they're like, "Okay, Peter is like this uneducated, common man." Like their words, they called him that. They're like, he hasn't been trained up to like know how to do any of this stuff or speak like this and speak with this power. He's just a dude, like just a fisherman. The fisherman being like a working man. And back then, fishermen had a different connotation than it does today, I think. They're still like commercial fishing, but a lot of times we think of a fisherman, like fishing is like recreational. Like it's something fun to do on the weekends. Like my dad is a big fisherman, I would consider him, and he just like loves to do it, but that's not what he does for a living. Back then, it was kind of like a generational trade. So they probably got this from like their fathers and their fathers before them. It was passed down. Like when they did the work that they would do was it was generational. It wasn't just like they graduated high school and they picked a job and they went off and got trained and whatever else. So this is like a culture of passing down skills and knowledge and like all the information that you need and the skill sets to be a fisherman. Like it's just different than how we think of things today. This was a family business or a family like operation, and it sounds like there was a partnership. I think in Luke, the account there tells us that they partnered with James and John, the sons of Zebedee. So it looks like multiple families and probably generational on both sides. And this wasn't just like a summer job. Like these guys were masters of their craft. They knew the sea, they knew the weather, they knew all of the details they needed to be successful. Like every time they go out to make this their livelihood. My understanding is like these guys would have done a lot of this work at nighttime. Like at that point, the wind and the waves are calmer, and so that they're not fighting against that during the day. So they knew all the details about what it takes to catch fish, like with nets in the dark. Like they're skilled craftsmen. And in today's society, I was trying to think of like an example of how what I could draw it to, and I don't think it's a perfect example, but I think farming a lot of times can be generational, where it's passed on from your family. And I went to school with a guy who his parents owned a grass seed farm in the Willamette Valley, and like I would drive past that and be like, okay, you plant it, you water it, and it's like what else is there? But there's like a ton more than that. There's a lot more than that. But they would pay attention to like the pH of the soil, the what nutrients were lacking, what they could do to provide the nutrients for the grass. They knew not just like it needs water. They knew like how much, how often. They knew when to plant, when to harvest. Like there was so much more to it that goes into it. And again, I don't think that's a perfect example here, but it's kind of the closest I could come up with. So it was more than just like planting and watering a grassy field. And Peter being a fisherman was more than just knowing how to catch fish for dinner. These guys were skilled craftsmen at what they were doing. So Jesus calling Peter and the others to follow him and leave all this behind. And how did they respond? Like they left their nets and they followed him. This wasn't like I've gone fishing with my kids and we'll like forget a bobber or, even leave a fishing pole like on the bank. Like that's not what this was. This wasn't like accidentally leaving something behind. This was intentional. They left their nets, like the nets that they had laid out to dry each day, that they'd folded up and put neatly away back in the boat, that they cared for, that provided their livelihood, their income. They left their boats. They left their family's tradition, their trade. Like it probably had some sentimental culture. Like, when you're like in a job and everybody's like in it together, like there's something to that. And they walk away from that. They're willing to do that. And it says that, I thought this was interesting. So James and John, it says they even leave their father there, right? They're like, see, Dad, we're going to go follow Jesus. There wasn't an exit strategy. There wasn't training of replacements to like fill in while they're gone. It wasn't like a Friday afternoon where they just wrapped up a few things and took off for the weekend. And notice Jesus didn't offer them a job and then be like, okay, I'm going to give you 2 weeks and I'm going to come back and check in and see how you're feeling about it, right? Like there's a little bit of a sense of urgency here. They were ready to follow Jesus, right? Weren't prepared. They couldn't have been, right? They weren't interviewed. They weren't sent to a training camp and given like a list of job requirements. They weren't given a packing list. They weren't, told like that they needed to do all this stuff to come and follow. They were just simply asked to follow. And that the implication there is that we don't need to bring or be anything, right? Jesus has it covered. This tells us that Jesus, when he asks us to follow, he's not asking us to be, experienced or have, to bring anything to the table with us. And that gives me a lot of hope personally. So when I think about like Jesus calling us to follow, I have some doubts. I'm going to go through those real quick. When I think about Jesus calling me to participate in the work he has, I think I don't know enough. I don't have the skills. I'm an awkward speaker. Whatever I come up with, there's fears and doubts that I would not be useful to God. I assume God couldn't use a simple guy like me. And I would assume that some of you guys feel the same way. Like we think, and same thing, Peter, surely, God, surely you mean someone else. Surely you have someone better, more prepared to do what you're calling them to do. Peter felt the same way. And if we look at the same story in Luke 5, it says that Peter felt unworthy of being in Jesus' presence. He says, and I'm going to quote this here, it says, "Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord." And he's right. He was unworthy. He wasn't prepared. He wasn't educated. He wasn't a trained religious leader. And I like to think he probably wasn't a gifted speaker. He was awkward too. And that's good news for us, guys. We also are unworthy. We also are not prepared. We cannot prepare ourselves. But Jesus is worthy. He is worthy of being followed, and by his power, Jesus can prepare us for what is to come if we are ready to follow. So when Peter told Jesus he was unworthy, Jesus told him not to fear and follow him anyway. So he did. He left everything behind, all the boats and nets and all that stuff. And he went on to become a fisher of men. And notice how Jesus speaks to him here, right? He's telling Peter that there's work to do. There's people to be reeled in for God's kingdom. And he's talking directly to Peter in a language that he can understand. Peter knows what it means to fish for something, right? And there's going to be wind and waves, storms to watch out for, and it's going to be like hard work. But Peter will go on later to tell the world about Jesus, and anyone who believes will be caught up for his kingdom. We're going to jump ahead here real quick to Matthew 16. We're going to look at a couple of Jesus and Peter's interactions after Peter's decided that he's ready to follow. So in Matthew 16, Jesus is asking his disciples who they say he is. And Peter responds in chapter 16, verse 16. Jesus is asking the disciples who they say that he is. And Simon Peter replied, You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Spot on. Here, Peter is confessing and proclaiming that Jesus is Lord. He's acknowledging that he is God in the flesh, the one who brings the kingdom of heaven near to us. And then Jesus replies in verses 17 and 18. Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. So verse 17, Jesus, he literally points out that Peter had not been prepared to give this answer. He didn't read this in a book. He wasn't taught this in some training. God revealed this to Peter because Peter was ready to follow. And there's another key takeaway in Jesus' response. Jesus says that the church will be built on the fact that he is the Christ, that he's God in the flesh, the promised one who would redeem God's people. Jesus is the rock that the church will be built on, that the church is built on. Now, for the kids in the room who are old enough to remember some of this, we talked about foundations just before Easter. We talked about Jesus being the solid rock that we can build on. Like if we build walls and a roof of a building and there's nothing solid for it, like over time, it might not happen right away, but over time it'll settle and it'll collapse. And Jesus is saying that he is that rock, that he is that foundation that we can start with and on which everything else stands. So back to Peter. In this moment, like Peter really got it right? He had like the correct answer, like the most correct answer, but he doesn't always. And he's definitely not perfect. I think if it stopped there and we just read how Peter like got all the answers right, he would seem kind of like unrelatable. You know what I mean? How could we relate to this guy that had, like this perfect answer? So just after this, we're going to look in verse 21. Jesus is explaining to his disciples that he would be that he would suffer and die and be raised again. And he might not have like said it explicitly, but he was talking about his crucifixion. He knew what was to come, and he was trying to give them like a heads up of what was to come. Jesus knew that he had to do this. And then in verse 22, right after he's explaining this to them, Peter rebukes Jesus. He says, "Surely you shall never die." Like he doesn't have the full understanding of what Jesus has to do. He doesn't fully comprehend God's plan. And Jesus responds to Peter like pretty aggressively in verse 23. I'll read that straight from the text here. But he turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." Heavy words. So Peter didn't and couldn't comprehend all of God's plan. He knew that Jesus was God in the flesh, and it didn't make sense to him that like he could die, right? So like we have the benefit of living on like after this, and we have all of this explained to us, right? Like we have God's word that it details the series of events and everything that was to come. And Peter didn't have that, so it's not far-fetched to think of like, yeah, like I could see how he would think that Jesus surely couldn't die. He's been healing all of these people, taking care of them. Like how can he do that? But then he is mortal and is going to allow himself to be put to death. So Peter's definitely someone we can relate to, right? Like sometimes we get it right, and more often than not, we don't. It's Peter's willingness to follow, like his readiness, that I want us to pay attention to. And Peter, like to kind of sum this up, like Peter wanted to be close to Jesus. And we're gonna move on to a couple more stories, but we're gonna come back to Peter's desire to be close to Jesus. So now we're gonna look at when Jesus calls Matthew, and that's in Matthew 9. So we'll flip there real quick. And I'm just going to read Matthew chapter 9, verse 9. It's short, don't miss it. As Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax booth, and he said to him, "Follow me." And he rose and followed him. One verse, right? Like this one's pretty brief. Jesus calls on Matthew to follow, and Matthew responds by following. There's no exit strategy, no training up replacements. He leaves his tax booth behind, and he follows, prepared or not, like not preparing anything that he was leaving. Again, so Matthew probably knew who Jesus was. It wasn't just some random dude who walked up and said, "Hey, like, come with me." That'd be kind of silly. Matthew was a tax collector. And tax collectors in this time weren't really like friends of the people. They weren't thought of very highly. They would make their living by, like, when they collected taxes, they would just take a little extra and then just pocket that. You know what I mean? Like, people didn't like them, I guess is probably a simple way to say it. And like the religious leaders at the time, some of the Pharisees, they were really thrown off because here was Jesus hanging out with, just after this, he's having dinner with them, these tax collectors, and they're like sitting at the table. He's like, how can you be the promised one to come, and you're hanging out with these people? Like tax collectors. I think maybe of like, like when debt collectors or whatever, that you don't really ever want to be talking to them. And here's Jesus is like sitting at the table with them. But even though he was a tax collector and there was this baggage that comes with, what he did for work, Jesus still called him, right? And he was willing to follow. He was ready. And again, there wasn't an interview. He wasn't given a list of things to prepare. He wasn't given a list of like skills he needed to go take a class on or anything like that. Just come, follow me, and he did. And next we're going to jump to a story that kind of helps clarify the urgency of Jesus' call to follow him. We're going to be in Matthew 8, 21 and 22. And so Jesus has just healed Peter's mother-in-law, and he's about to move to the other side of the sea. And it's like he's going to take some of his followers, like they're gathering up and they're getting ready to physically move like across the sea. And I'm going to read 8, 21 and 22. Another of the disciples said to him, "Lord, let me first go and bury my father." And Jesus said to him, "Follow me and leave the dead to bury their own dead." Now this one, this one feels a little weird at first, right? Like this guy's trying to do an honorable thing to go and bury his father, and like before he takes off to follow Jesus. We would assume that he's just being responsible, like taking care of the things that he's been, given to take care of. In that time, I think it was the responsibility of the children to bury the father. So he's about to take off, but he needs to take care of something that's important, right? And both of these things are important: to follow Jesus and to bury his father, to take care of things we need to take care of. Jesus isn't saying. He's not saying that to go and bury his father is unimportant. He's just simply telling us that following him is more important. There's this urgency here that even though Jesus is patient with us, there's work to be done both like in our lives and around the world. And that's what he's saying to this disciple. The consequences we're talking about here impact eternity, right? Like, this isn't just a fact of burying his father. Like, Jesus is saying that there are eternal consequences to what we're talking about right now. And when we die, like those of us who have chosen to follow Jesus get to be with him in heaven for all eternity. And so Jesus says the dead can bury their dead. And he's highlighting that urgency for us here. He's telling his followers to set aside like other good things and let someone else take care of them. He has things for us to do. So we think of, there's like a long list we could come up of good things, right, guys? Like, let's see, what did I write down here? Taking care of family and friends, serving in our community, volunteering to coach a kids sports team, or like honoring and burying someone after they die. All good, all very important, but Jesus is simply more important. So we're going to look at another story here. This is when Jesus feeds the 5,000. And this is a story like I've heard and read countless times. But as I was reading through it leading up to Easter, like there was a detail that hit me that isn't like explicitly called out, but I took note of it, and I think it's really cool. So we're going to look at that. So let's go to Matthew 14. Verses 13 through 21. I'm just going to read through it, and then we'll break it down. Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a desolate place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them and healed their sick. Now when it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a desolate place, and the day is now over. Send the crowds away to go into the villages and buy food for themselves." But Jesus said, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." They said to him, "We have only 5 loaves here and 2 fish." And he said, "Bring them here to me." And he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing. Then he broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. And they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of the broken pieces left over. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. So at the beginning of this, Jesus is just trying to go to like a quiet place and have like some peace and quiet. And there's these crowds that follow him. They hear where he's going, and they follow him anyway. And when he sees the great crowds, it says that he had compassion on them and heals their sick. He's performing miracles here, like just by healing their afflictions. And I don't want to just skip past that. He's demonstrating to these people and to us that he has power and authority in this world, and that he's not just some like wise teacher or good worldly leader. He's showing us that he was God in the flesh, fully God, fully man. And then he goes on to perform the main miracle of this story. And he feeds 5,000 men, like plus women and children, from 5 loaves and 2 fish. That's not a small detail, right? I don't want to just blaze past that. Again, he's displaying his power and authority in this world. This is a really tangible way he's caring for them by feeding them, right? And this is where the detail I was talking about really like hit me as I read through this. I'm reading through this and I'm like, they didn't pack a lunch. These people didn't pack a lunch. It sounds really silly to think about that, but think about it. Like we have a crowd of 5,000 men, women, and children. There's probably entire families here in this gathering, and they follow Jesus out to this desolate place, not like downtown. Like pick somewhere out in the middle of the valley, walk there, and don't take anything with you. Like no preparations, and take your kids. They go all that way just to be near to Jesus and hear him speak. They weren't concerned about the food. So for me, like if I'm thinking about taking my family anywhere, like church downtown for a walk around the block, like we're gonna have snacks, we're gonna have water bottles, we might have extra clothes. Like if we're going to the woods in one of the rigs, I'll take tools in case something breaks down, recovery gear in case we get stuck. The boys know that well. Like I'm going to be thinking of anything I can possibly take to go anywhere. And here they are. They just follow Jesus. This crowd of thousands, and they're so intent on just being near to Jesus and hearing him speak that they go without food. And I don't think that they were just being like unwise. It wasn't just that they didn't think about the food, I don't think. I think that they might have known like we might get hungry. But that's not what they were concerned about. They knew that like even if they did get hungry, like even if they had to skip lunch, skip dinner, whatever, hearing what Jesus had to say was more important. They could get past the hunger if they had Jesus there. They realized the urgency and the importance of being near him. So, as we've talked about these words of prepared and ready, they were clearly not prepared to be out in this desolate place, right? But they were ready to follow him and listen to what he had to say. So just after Jesus feeds the 5,000, feeds this massive crowd, we see another cool, Peter comes back in the story. We see this really cool example of Peter's desire to be near to Jesus, just like the crowd. So to set the stage, he sends his disciples across the sea while he's like dismissing the crowd, and then he goes up on a mountain to pray. And when he comes down, it's like, late into the night, maybe into the morning, and the boat's really far from the shore. Like, it's way out there. And this is the story we hear of, Jesus walking on water, right? He just walks out there. And this is another one of those miracles I don't want to just gloss over. He walks out to them, he gets to their boat, and they're afraid. Like, he thinks they're a ghost. And he says, "Don't worry, guys, like, it's just me. I just walked out here on the water. No big deal. No need to be afraid." And we're gonna read. I want to highlight Peter's response here. We're gonna look at Matthew 14 verses 26 through 33. It says here in 26. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It is a ghost," and they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." And Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. And those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." So let's pause here real quick. Remember, Peter's a fisherman, right? Like, Peter knows he can't walk on water. Of all the people in the world, like, Peter should know he can't walk on water, right? He had lots and lots of time on the sea. Like, every time he got in and out of the boat at the shore, I imagine him, like, walking in the shallows and getting the boat ready and, like, climbing in. He knows, like, his feet don't stay on top of it. They go to the bottom. He probably saw, like, maybe at one point I don't know if they, like, swam or, like, jumped in the water for fun, or maybe he saw somebody fall out of a boat. Like, he surely knew that people, when they hit the water, they sink, right? He was well aware that people couldn't stay on top of the water. But here he is, confident in who Jesus is. He knew that the power of Jesus could keep him from sinking, and he wanted to be near to Jesus, so he asked him to command him. Peter asked Jesus to command Peter to come out to Jesus. And notice the way he asked Jesus. It's not like he's asking for a spotter at the gym. He's not like, "I got this, but if you could be here as backup, that'd be great. I probably don't need you, but whatever." He knows he can't do it, right? He knows it's only possible by Jesus' power and authority. And he asks Jesus to command him, to tell him to come out there. This is a good reminder for us, for me, that we don't just need Jesus as like a backup plan, as a spotter when we're weak. We can't just push ahead on our own and, phone our friend Jesus when things get tough. When we run out of supplies or our skills fall short. And Peter, he couldn't have trained or prepared for this, right? The only thing he could do is make his mind ready. Ready to trust in the power and authority of Jesus. And notice that his readiness wasn't even perfect in this story, guys. He's out there on the waves, and he starts to have some doubts. He sees the wind, and he starts to falter. And who could blame him, right? Like, he knows what that's capable of. His faith wavers, and he starts to sink. And he calls out to Jesus. And as he has this desire to be close to Jesus, it stands out to me. That desire is what really stands out to me here. And that just like the crowds who followed Jesus without a dinner plan, like, here's this fisherman who steps out of a trusty boat, like he's trust every other day that he's gone out on the sea. He chooses Jesus as the one who's going to keep him afloat. One more note about Peter before we wrap up. I want to point out that he wasn't referred to as a fisherman going forward. It's not that he forgot how to fish or he didn't lose that skill set. He might not have had his stuff anymore, but we're told later in, I think, John's gospel that he goes fishing again. So he certainly still knows how to do it. But that's not where his identity is anymore. He's not wrapped up in being a fisherman. That's not what is the emphasis of his life. There's a priority shift here, and following Jesus is just more important than being a fisherman. And this is the same for us. When we're ready to follow Jesus, it doesn't mean that we have to, we don't forget how to be teachers and builders and, whatever else we do. We still do those things, but that's just not where our identity is found. So in all these stories, we've seen this theme of like readiness, or ready but unprepared people choosing to follow Jesus. And I think it's important for us to remember that when Jesus calls us, he's not asking us to come prepared. He invites us to come as we are, like Peter, an uneducated, common people, like just a dude. There's nothing we can do to earn our way into following him or being his disciple. Not by knowing enough or having the right skills or training ourselves up. We should, if we start to think that way, we should remember all of the prepared and trained people at this time that didn't follow, right? There were plenty of religious leaders at this time who were well-spoken. They probably spoke in front of crowds often. They knew the scriptures, they knew the prophecies, and they spoke with, what seemed like some confidence, but it was their confidence in themselves. And what we focus on today is a fisherman. Not the Pharisees who questioned him, but the fisherman. An uneducated, common man, because he was ready to follow. And once we decide we are ready to follow, there's going to be bumps along the way. Remember all of Peter's shortcomings, right? The work in him was ongoing. The work in us is ongoing. And we read in Philippians a couple weeks back from Tanner. Philippians 1:6. I'll just read it real quick. Paul's writing to the Philippians and he says, "And I am sure of this, that he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion at the day of Jesus Christ." We're not finished. Praise God. So, like when we lose focus and we begin to sink, like Peter, like Jesus is there ready to reach out a hand. And as we think about that, let's remember that Peter still looked back to Jesus, right? He started to falter and he started to sink, but he didn't try to like muscle his way out of there. He wasn't like, "Oh, I've taken swimming lessons, like I got this." He said, like, I need Jesus to pull me up out of this. And so the focus is on Jesus, and then even when we forget that or when we falter, it's still him. So before we end, I want to point out, like, this isn't telling us to live life completely unprepared. This isn't like a free pass to just not take care of business or whatever. Like, pack a lunch, do a good job at work, take care of important things, but don't let those things get in the way. There's this self-righteousness that creeps in when we start to like pride ourselves on always being prepared. I don't know about like, I can relate to like some of the guys in the room, like always having the right tool for the job or whatever. Like we start to like puff ourselves up, right? And I heard last weekend somebody tell me like, don't buy that tool. Borrow it from someone else. Need someone else occasionally, right? So as we close up here, let's focus on Jesus being the one who prepares us for good work. As we go throughout our weeks, throughout our months, throughout, work, school, whatever you've got going on, think about this question of like, are we ready to follow him? Are we trying to like prepare everything ourselves? One of those will last.